Will the left win? That is the question for this video. Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy, where we try to better our perceptions of the world through philosophical discussion. Today I am responding to Philosophytube, also known as Ollie. Ollie has a master's in philosophy, so he is definitely a knowledgeable guy. His video is actually really good. He's also a Geordie like me, so it's funny that we both got masters and we're in philosophy, and we're both from Newcastle. I think we went to different institutions though to get it, so there's probably some differences in specializations. In Ollie's video, he argues that the left will win. Now, I accept that premise, but I disagree on how.
In the last few years, the right wing has gained ground across America and Europe, but despite that, I think there's a fundamental ideological reason why the left will win.
Part 1. Love.
In her book, The Capacity Contract, scholar Stacey Clifford Simplicon makes this beautiful distinction between two different kinds of political communities. The first, we'll call them communities of strength. It's when you say to somebody, you're in my political team because you can do something, because you're strong, because you're fast, intelligent, because you speak the same language as me, because you have the potential for greatness in you because of your heritage or your genes or whatever. In contrast, the left has the potential, although we don't always use it, to create a fundamentally different and entirely incompatible kind of political family, a community of vulnerability, where we say to somebody, you're on our team, not because of what you can do or because you can work hard or speak English or anything like that, but because we both need something. We both need healthcare, shelter, justice, time off from work. Why do I think communities of vulnerability are ultimately going to win out? Because of the power of shame.
In his book On Escape, the philosopher Levinas discusses the shame of vulnerability. Shame arises each time we are unable to make others forget our basic nudity. It is related to everything we would like to hide and that we cannot bury or cover up. This preoccupation with dressing to hide ourselves concerns every manifestation of our lives, our acts, and our thoughts.
So I think Ollie makes a really good point distinguishing between communities of strength and communities of vulnerability. And the argument here is that the communities of vulnerability will win out because they have a greater overall appeal because of shame. We all have certain features in our lives that we need to satisfy. We are all humans, so we have basic needs like food, water, shelter, healthcare, and education, etc. What he's arguing is that the left has a greater appeal because we are willing to help those in need. We're willing to bring people into the fold, not because they are strong, but because we are willing to work together to fulfill our basic needs. Now that's a really good point. I completely agree. And I think a really good example of this in history is the success of the Catholic Church. Now, Catholic means universal for a reason. The idea was that it was the first concept of equality. I'm using like equality like that because obviously it's not the same equality as we have today, but it is a kind of equality. Everyone was able to reach salvation under God. Obviously there is a hierarchy there, and the point being it was the first instance of equality that was massively distributed. Now that meant that it was really successful. As an ideological stance, Catholicism and Christianity spread like wildfire, and the reason for that was its universality. Anyone could join. So communities of vulnerability versus communities of strength. A community of vulnerability does have an overall greater appeal to a larger universal base. You can join if you are human because we all have universal needs. And as he says, that is the power of love. We come together in order to aid each other. However, a community of strength offers something a community of vulnerability might not. And that is, a type of salvation, a way of overcoming the problems that you face. So if you are fleeing, if you are shameful and you are fleeing, these vulnerabilities, you will be drawn into the strength that a community of strength portrays. So the issue is the appeal of a community of strength is fairly large. And that is because individuals who are oppressed look for solutions. In Nazi Germany, kind of rose out of the depression. We all know that people were starving at the time. They were looking for solutions. And so Nazism came up and they jumped at it because they thought strength, power, we can not starve anymore. And this is the problem with shame in that regard. people will flee into these movements as well. Now, that won't offer a solution, and ultimately they will be crushed beneath these fascist organisations. Don't get me wrong, their freedom will be limited and they will end up under an authoritarian regime which will actually make their lives worse. But they don't see that at that time. And that's the power of propaganda. As Bernays says, no matter how sophisticated, how cynical the public may become about publicity methods, it must respond to the basic appeals, because it will always need food, crave amusement, long for beauty, respond to leadership. Now, what Bernays shows is that an individual seeks leadership or power. They look for something that will allow them to escape. Now, as Levinas says, an individual cannot escape from themselves. However, if you are, like Ollie argues, looking at a group and associating a single characteristic you see in yourself, then you feel at home. And that is an unfortunate power play that a fascist or a particular right-wing organisation may offer. So to say that a community of vulnerability will win out because of the power of shame is not necessarily the case. We need to show that we have solidarity, that we have a power structure that, will allow people to overcome their problems, because otherwise people will not see the appeal in joining. Now that brings us to the point of desire.
And the thing is, human beings are always going to be vulnerable. We're always going to get old. We're always going to get sick. And so a political family that brings people together by saying, hey, it's okay, we're all vulnerable and you don't need to be ashamed of it, is always going to have some kind of appeal. Vulnerability is the beginning of true solidarity. Even in the most starry-eyed white supremacists' dream future, people are still going to be vulnerable and they're still going to be drawn to ideologies that say, hey, that's okay. That's actually why punching Nazis, whatever you think of it morally and practically as a tactic, is ideologically quite a clever move, because nothing exposes the lie of somebody crowing about how they're a super strong master race faster than getting their ass handed to them. It's a community of strength that builds up its strength so much that it can't take a hit.
Well, punching Nazis, I would argue, is actually probably one of the worst things you can do, mainly because it allows a polarization between you and the Nazi. So the reality is you are both human, right? And if you are both fleeing from your vulnerabilities, what you should be doing is try to appeal to those who are ideologically naive. They've joined this party not because they are racist, horrible human beings, but because they are told that other individuals are the cause of their suffering.
They took our jobs! Yeah, they're down!
They are convinced by propaganda, by lies, and by the manufacturing of consent that this is the way to be to overcome their problems. Now, what you should be showing them is actually this is flawed. This is not how you overcome your problems. This is how you get in your problems. So if you start saying like what we need to do is punch a Nazi, what you're doing is you're creating a divide, and that will allow propaganda to flourish, because it'll allow war to begin. War is a fundamental divisionary tactic given by the powerful.
About 70% of the population has no way of influencing policy. They might as well be in some other country. And the population knows it. What it's led to is a population that's angry, frustrated, hates institutions. It's not acting constructively to try to respond to this. There is popular mobilization and activism, but in very self-destructive directions. It's taking the form of unfocused anger, attacks on one another, and on vulnerable targets. That's what happens in cases like this. The point is to make people hate and fear each other and look out only for themselves and don't do anything for anyone else.
If we're divided, we will be conquered easily by any ideological stance because we will have no solidarity. So you're saying that at first we need solidarity, but then you're saying, oh well, punching a Nazi is a good idea. Well, no, because you're not going to have solidarity unless you're having solidarity against Nazis, and then you've just got war. Now, as appealing as it might seem at first that, we will defeat the Nazis and, their vile propagandist ways, and it will not work. Not because we would not necessarily defeat the Nazis, but because Nazism as a community of strength, or, communities of strength in general, they flourish on conflict. To seem powerful is vitally important when you are in conflict. So painting someone as the enemy and, their offspring and, their children and family members and so on, these communities who ally themselves basically with these groups will then feel under attack and feel like they have to join in order to defend themselves, and you will actually strengthen this community. Also, what happens when the Nazi punches back? Okay, then we've got conflict, and this conflict could be bloody, it could be horrible, it could be vicious, and it's between two human beings who should not be fighting in the first place. You've caused a conflict. You haven't prevented one. You haven't stopped Nazis from, doing this horrible stuff. You've started the chain of events that has led to violence. And really, that will be your own fault and your own undoing, because Nazis and, right-wing movements are fairly efficient. Okay, now that's not to say that they're good, but it's that they're able to mobilize a force of individuals in a way that people who care about human rights cannot do. Because we care about people, we would not do the things to our populations that a right-wing movement might, that a really vicious movement will exploit the population under a guise of warfare, of conflict, of propaganda, and that will allow them to create a viciously strong state that will destabilize unless it goes to war. So to say that punching a Nazi is a good idea is fundamentally flawed. Although you might show some weaknesses in the community of strength, once people feel vulnerable, they will become more solid. They will become more united in order to fight you, the aggressor.
It's slightly cliche to bring up 1984 in a political chat, but I've got a bit of a different take on the bleakest bit of the book. In George Orwell's famous novel about fascism, the villainous O'Brien says to the hero, Winston, "If you want a vision of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever." That's a disturbing image, but I think that there is hope even in that, because by O'Brien's own admission, the oppression of the party will have to continue being done forever. It will never stop. The party can never ultimately win. It can just keep fighting. The oppression has to be continuously forced, which means it isn't naturally occurring. It's not inevitable. It could, in theory, be changed. And although the bad guys do win at the end of the novel, it's notable that Winston only begins resisting when he makes himself vulnerable to Julia by falling in love with her.
So I really appreciate that Ollie is a romantic, and I think it's quite sweet. And I think that when he's speaking about this hope in defeat, it is actually, fairly true. However, take 1984, this idea of the boot stamping on a human face, this power structure that is always oppressing individuals. Now, in 1984, it's an authoritarian structure, but a very important part of this authoritarian structure was propaganda. It was able to manipulate people, and propaganda in reality is able to convince people hegemonically to commit the actions themselves. If you can create someone, you can manipulate their desires to follow through with your actions. You can place your agenda upon theirs. They will think that to be a good citizen, they must do whatever you want them to do.
Shout! Shout! Shout out his name!
And an example of this in reality would be people turning in their neighbors to the Gestapo. People who've known each other their whole lives, betraying each other to a secret police because they were told it was the right thing to do. This is the third dimension of power, okay? This doesn't have to be authoritarian, it can be disciplinary. You can convince people to follow through with the actions you want them to. You don't have to constantly be over them to have an authoritarian control. You don't need more police than people when people police themselves. If you're interested in learning about the dimensions of power, I do have a video on that. However, there is hope, as Ollie says, not because of the authoritarian nature of the government that is constantly stamping on the human face, but rather in the fact that if you are being forced to police yourselves, your main enemy is yourself. You can overcome propaganda through education, through attention to reality. If you observe reality, you will meet moral obligations. As Levinas says, the poor one, the stranger, presents himself as an equal. His equality within this essential poverty consists in referring to the third party, thus present at the encounter, whom in the midst of his destruction the other already serves. He comes to join me, but he joins me to himself for service. He commands me as a master. This command can concern me only inasmuch as I am a master myself. Consequently, this command commands me to command. The thou is posited in front of a we. This is why the relation with the other, discourse, is not only the putting in the question of my freedom. The appeal coming from the other to call me to responsibility is not only the speech by which I first myself of the possession that encircles me by setting forth an objective and common world. If we observe individuals and their suffering, now doesn't mean to cause people suffering, by the way, that means to just see what happens in the world, then we will be met with moral obligations. We will want to avoid, we will want to stop that suffering because we will associate that with ourselves and our own suffering. We will see another's vulnerability, as Ollie points out, in ourselves, and it's compassion and caring. It is that love that ties us together as a group and allows us to overcome this propaganda. However, we need to bring people's moral baselines higher than the propaganda tries to lower them down to. And the way you do that is by showing them the reality of their actions. If you don't want someone to be a Nazi, you need to convince them that black people, Jewish people, people like all around the world who would be harmed by their movement would be harmed by it, and they have equal moral considerability to them. And that is how you prevent someone from even becoming a Nazi, and that is far more valuable than harming them, than starting a conflict with them. You don't need war. What we need is passive resistance. Any physical conflict, you used a quote from Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was very against violence for a particular reason.
Well, one is to rise up in open violence, in physical violence. And some persons have used that method, persons who have been oppressed. But I think the danger of that method is its futility. I feel that violence creates many more social problems than it solves.
May I interrupt you there, Dr. King? There are today certainly people who are forced to endure a kind of injustice that neither you nor even Gandhi in his time had ever seen. For example, would you regard the martyrs of Hungary's rebellion a year ago as misguided men and having used violence?
I admire freedom fighters wherever they are, but I still believe that nonviolence is the strongest approach. I think that would apply to the Hungarian situation also. I don't think it's limited to a particular locality. I think it should apply in every situation in the world where individuals seek to break loose from the bondage of colonialism or from some totalitarian regime or from the system which we confront in America.
You truly believe, then, that nonviolence is the sole, the universal answer to injustice and oppression?
Very definitely. Very definitely.
There's people like Malcolm X who were promoting violence, and the Black Panthers and stuff, and they weren't effective. Martin Luther King was effective, and he showed that passive resistance was by far more effective because he was able to show the reality of the oppression that was going on. When they were crushed under the authoritarian regime that was oppressing black people, what he showed was the injustice that was occurring to black people of that time. And that is how you overcome the propaganda in things like 1984.
Part 2. Victimhood.
Now, if you're a liberal, or you're further right-wing than that, you might be saying, hang on a minute, you leftists can't claim to have a monopoly on vulnerability, and you certainly can't claim to have a monopoly on love. Let's take an extreme example, just to prove the point, okay? The loyal white knights of the KKK. Very, very right-wing. But they say on their website how they love the white race, and how we are vulnerable to society being attacked by homosexuals and drug addicts and Jews. But in her book, The Cultural Politics of Emotion, scholar Sarah Ahmed dissects the kind of love that hate groups claim to have, and says that to say we love our people and mean only white people is to say, I love you as long as you're strong in the same ways as I think of strong. So white, probably Christian, probably not LGBT, certainly not too poor. It's I love you so long as you reflect me. It's the love of the self, narcissism really, projected outwards. It's not the kind of love that says, I love you, vulnerabilities and all.
I would agree with this point that, it is narcissism reflected outwards. However, narcissism reflected outwards, it provides something to the ego, perhaps a movement that is truly compassionate and shows only caringness will not show. If you cannot show strength, then no one will have a desire to join because they will feel more vulnerable through joining you. We try and create a solidarity movement where we go, we must join together to overcome our suffering, but then people think that if they join, they will suffer. They won't join, okay? So you need people to know that if they join together, they will be strong. Workers of the world unite, all we have to lose is our chains. The idea is that you can't go lower, but the sky's the limit on how far you can actually achieve. The left wing has the possibility of creating a society that is truly free and equal. That's something that no other political stance can offer. If you have an authoritarian regime, you will be crushed beneath it. And that's something that you have to make people aware of, that you will in fact suffer more in a community of strength. You have to bring their horizon to the possibilities of suffering more. As Locke says, it's better to have 100,000 men angry at you than one man with the power of 100,000. If you see yourself underneath a fascist regime and that crushing you beneath it and that you can't revolt, then you would have been better off never joining it in the first place. You'd have been better off never creating this authoritarian regime which can really cause you suffering.
The idea that those on the right are under some kind of attack from minorities or diversity or feminism or whatever has been around for millennia, literally. In her book Backlash, scholar Susan Faludi gives a history not of feminist progress, but of all the times progress has been undone by a backlash. There's this great bit where she talks about Roman lawmakers getting really angry when women were allowed to drive chariots for the first time. And they said, women are taking over men's spaces. This in a society where women weren't even allowed to vote. And people still make that same women taking over men's spaces argument today about everything from politics to video games.
So I would disagree with Ollie when he says that people make arguments that women are taking over men's spaces today. For the most part, we are equal, and most people agree that women are equal to men. Don't get me wrong, there are people who will make these points, however, they are the minority. If you look at the people who are even making radical nationalist points and stuff, they are the minority. They will be minorities which will go against even the normal cultural good. They will see something good and they'll be like, no, we need to destroy that. But these are the same people that end up being criminals, and the same people that are trying to fight for power. And these aren't good people, and they're not the average person. So to say that today these arguments are made, yes, they are, but by the minority. As Chomsky says, today, when the right of property is the last undestroyed remnant of the aristocratic world, when it alone is left standing, the sole privilege in an equalized society.
What Ahmed and Faludi illustrate is that communities of strength sometimes attempt a version of vulnerability, but it comes out wrong, because true vulnerability is just ideologically incompatible. So it emerges as this kind of false victimhood with no real basis in material distributions of money and power. The classic example is white supremacy, which says that white people are naturally superior. But that on its own isn't going to draw a lot of people in, because a lot of white people are still miserable because of capitalism. So the white supremacist has to posit this additional ridiculous conspiracy theory about the world secretly being run by Jews in an attempt to keep white people down. I've talked about these myths before in detail if you're curious. That isn't community of vulnerability, that's community of strength trying to explain why it isn't even stronger. For all those saying that conservatism is the new counterculture and the new punk rock, it's just not on the money, because counterculture has always been about resisting or avoiding domination, not being part of domination's backlash.
Ollie does make a good point. There are people on YouTube claiming that they are the conservative counterculture, that this right-wing resurgence is because of this victimhood they are feeling because the left is attacking them. Now, the unfortunate reality is in many ways there are left-wing individuals who are on the offensive. You have individuals who are becoming increasingly militaristic with their ideological stances. They are no longer passive, and that is a problem. So take with feminism. There are feminists who are coming up with ideological stances which are just unfounded, who place white men as a power or an authority over the world. Cis white males control everything. That is a false narrative that alienates a mass majority of a Western population. Why would you do this? You are alienating perhaps one of the most prevalent groups in the left wing.
Let's bring it back to black people being killed by police.
Okay.
What has Trump said about that?
What about white people being killed by police?
Fuck off!
It doesn't make any sense to alienate such a large group of people when you're trying to create a unified solidarity. So what you're doing there is you are attacking them. Okay, maybe not physically at times, but definitely ideologically.
You've never experienced oppression in your entire fucking life. Neither have I. You're fucking a white male!
And there is no getting out of this. You can either admit that you are a cis white male scumbag who authoritarianly controls the world, or you are the problem. You are a problematic white male. Now, the point is that white men are not the problem. The issue with our society is economic. Now, white men tend to have more money than, let's say, black men. There is a greater amount of poverty in the black community than in the white community, or at least to a greater extent. However, there are more white people on welfare in America than black people. It's not that white people are universally more successful, but more that black people are poor because of their historical pressure. You know, they did come from from slavery. They were exploited after slavery, even worse than white people. And even though they've been equalized, the trades haven't allowed them to gain greater economic force. Now, that does not mean that the equality doesn't exist, but equality of wealth is different to equality of opportunity. When right-wing people are calling out that they are victims, in some respects they are. You should be allowed to speak when you are a right-wing individual, no matter how disgusting your views are. If you think that, white people should rule the world and Nazism is the best thing ever, you should be allowed to say that. I won't agree with you, but I can express then that I don't agree with you, and that is the value of freedom of speech. So the problem is that the problem is white people. So the problem is not that these people are actually victims, but they will use these attacks to fundamentally promote their agenda. So that is why, Martin Luther King and so on were against this by any means necessary mentality, because all it does is push people away. It alienates individuals who could be your allies if you only showed them the justifications of your arguments. So if you do what feminism's done and, you try to follow through with a narrative which hasn't held up, patriarchy and all these different narratives that they've portrayed haven't really held up to scrutiny once equalization has come through, then what you find is that the power structure that is actually oppressing these people remains. So individuals will then start attacking random people who have no power. But if we unify together, then perhaps we can overcome both of our problems. That is one of the real powers of the community of vulnerability, to unify two individuals from seemingly different demographics under a unified moral banner.
And also, in fairness, victimhood and self-pity and making bigger conversations about ourselves aren't exclusive to the right. We can all do it. Feminist scholar Elizabeth Martinez cautions us against the oppression Olympics, where we take a conversation about politics and something that's bigger than ourselves, and we make it about our own oppression and say, oh, I'm oppressed in this way and that counts for more, or this is the most fundamental axis of oppression, or whatever.
We don't need more competition among different social groups for the gold medal of most oppressed. We don't need more comparisons of suffering between women and blacks, the disabled and the gay, Latino teenagers and white seniors, or whatever. Pursuing some hierarchy of oppression leads us down dead-end streets where we will never find the linkage between different oppressions and how to overcome them.
All I can say is bravo to that quote. Absolutely excellent. Really does show that unity has to overcome petty differences and combine into a unified whole rather than splitting up into dividing groups. As Deleuze says, the corporation constantly presents the brashest rivalry as a healthy form of emulation, an excellent motivational force that opposes individuals against one another and runs through each, dividing each within. Once we split into demographics, we can be placed against each other, which is why you don't punch Nazis.
But even as some truly dark things happen in the world, the left is always holding on, and we're starting to gain ground, especially here on YouTube. LeftTube, we're in our ascendancy, and not just liberal tube, LeftTube. Capitalism needs to go tube, we need a whole new philosophy tube. Some people say this is because of trends or algorithms or right-wing creators losing their touch, but I think there's this deeper ideological reason more and more people are vulnerable. So communities of strength just don't cut it. They never will. The place you want to be is the place where you can be you, unashamedly. Because it's our vulnerabilities that make us beautiful.
I agree that it is our vulnerabilities that make us beautiful. We can, if we can love each other past our vulnerabilities, then we're able to do something that is fundamentally important to a community of vulnerability. We can engage those who are stronger. And, if you're not disabled and you are standing up for the disabled, it's not out of a need or a desire to flee from your position, but out of compassion for someone else's. And that is how we unify. We show people their moral obligations, and we show them that we can help others. That we do not just care about ourselves, but we care about us all. And that is what a community of vulnerability does. It is an ethical dimension rather than an egoistic one. Rather than the narcissistic views of a fascist, it offers compassion, love, and caringness that these organizations will never offer. If you are struggling in life, we will be there for you. And that is the strength of a community of vulnerability. So yes, the left will win, but it needs to be strong when it does it. So I hope you all enjoyed this video. I actually really enjoyed making this response. I really find a lot of Ollie's content very insightful, and I think he's a smart guy. If he wants to debate anything I've said, he's welcome to challenge us, call us out. And, as always, try to gain some perspective.